A fragile peace. The Korean Peninsula on edge. The Korean Peninsula, a land scarred by history, forever divided. For decades, an uneasy truce held between North and South, but the peace was fragile, a powder keg waiting for a spark. North Korea, under its enigmatic leader, had embarked on a reckless path. Its nuclear ambitions a constant threat. Missile tests, each one a provocation, rattled nerves across the globe. The international community, led by the United States, responded with condemnation. Sanctions tightened their grip on North Korea's struggling economy. Diplomatic efforts time and again ended in stalemate. The world watched with bated breath, fearing the worst. The situation on the peninsula was like a pressure cooker, the heat steadily rising. Something had to give, and on one fateful day, it did, with devastating consequences. The world held its breath as the unthinkable became reality. War had returned to Korea. The accidental missile. A spark ignites the firestorm. It began, as these things often do, with a miscalculation. A routine training exercise gone tragically wrong. A North Korean missile, armed with a live warhead instead of a dummy payload, veered off course. It streaked across the sky, a fiery arc of destruction. Panic gripped the region. This was no test. The target, a remote U.S. military base in South Korea. The missile found its mark, obliterating everything in a radius of several miles. The death toll was immediate and catastrophic. American soldiers stationed far from home caught in the inferno. The world reeled in shock and disbelief. An accident or something more sinister? The White House was in chaos. President Thompson, his face grim, addressed the nation. He spoke of American lives lost, of a cowardly attack. He vowed swift and decisive action. Retribution was inevitable. The drums of war, silent for decades, began to beat once more. First strike retaliation and the opening salvos. Within hours, American bombers took to the skies. Their target, the North Korean missile base from which the errant projectile had been launched. Cruise missiles, guided by pinpoint accuracy, rained down on their target. The night sky erupted in a fiery inferno. The message was clear. America would not be intimidated. South Korea, its long-standing ally under attack, mobilized its forces. Tanks rumbled towards the DMZ, the heavily fortified border that had divided the peninsula for generations. Artillery batteries roared to life, sending shells screaming towards North Korean positions. The Second Korean War, long feared, had begun. Across the globe, leaders scrambled to contain the crisis. The United Nations Security Council convened for an emergency session. Condemnations rang out from world capitals, but to little avail. The dogs of war had been unleashed, and they were hungry for blood. U.S. military officer, we had to act swiftly. The missile strike was an unprovoked attack, and our response had to be decisive. We targeted their missile base to cripple their launch capabilities and send a clear message that such aggression would not be tolerated. The peninsula ablaze. A brutal ground war begins. The DMZ, once a symbol of a divided world, became a battleground. North Korean troops, fanatically loyal to their regime, poured across the border in a human wave. They were met by the determined resistance of South Korean and American forces. Tanks clashed in open fields, their cannons blazing. Helicopters dueled in the skies, spitting fire and death. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand in places. Casualties mounted on both sides, the ground littered with the dead and dying. Cities and towns along the border were reduced to rubble. Millions of civilians, caught in the crossfire, fled their homes, seeking safety that was nowhere to be found. The world watched in horror as the conflict escalated. The specter of nuclear war, once unthinkable, loomed large. The fate of the Korean Peninsula, and perhaps the world, hung in the balance. The stakes had never been higher. North Korean soldier. We were ordered to advance, no matter the cost. Our leaders said it was our duty to reunify the peninsula. We faced fierce resistance, but we were determined to push forward. The losses were heavy, but we couldn't turn back. We fought with everything we had.
The international community, deeply divided, struggled to respond to the escalating crisis.
The United States, its military might fully engaged, called upon its allies for support. NATO invoked Article 5, its collective defense clause, for the first time in its history. Warships from a dozen nations steamed towards the region.
On the other side, China and Russia, wary of American power in their backyard, threw their support behind North Korea. They provided weapons, supplies, and a steady stream of propaganda.
The conflict on the Korean Peninsula had become a proxy war, a dangerous game of brinkmanship between superpowers. As the fighting raged on, the world held its breath. The possibility of a wider conflict, one that could engulf the entire globe, loomed large. The Cold War, long thought consigned to the history books, seemed to be returning with a vengeance. The future of humanity hung in the balance.
Section 6. A Sea of Suffering. The humanitarian crisis unfolds. While armies clashed on the battlefield, a different kind of tragedy unfolded far from the front lines. Millions of refugees fleeing the fighting surged across borders, desperate for safety and aid. They were the forgotten victims of this senseless war, their lives shattered, their futures uncertain. Aid organizations, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis, struggled to provide food, water, and shelter to the displaced masses. Hospitals, overflowing with the wounded, lacked the resources to treat them all. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the human cost of conflict.
The world, its attention focused on the military conflict, was slow to respond to the humanitarian crisis. Appeals for aid went largely unanswered. The refugees, many of them women and children, were left to fend for themselves in overcrowded camps, their hopes dwindling with each passing day.
Section 7. Stalemate. A bloody battlefield offers no clear victor. Weeks turned into months, and still the war raged on. The initial North Korean offensive had stalled, bogged down by fierce resistance and relentless airstrikes. But the United States and its allies had been unable to deliver a knockout blow. The conflict had settled into a bloody stalemate, a war of attrition that seemed to have no end in sight. Casualties continued to mount on both sides. The once proud cities of North Korea, pounded by American bombs, lay in ruins. The South Korean economy, heavily reliant on trade, teetered on the brink of collapse. The world, weary of war, yearned for peace. But peace seemed as elusive as ever.
Behind the scenes, however, diplomatic efforts were underway. Secret talks, initiated by neutral countries, sought to find a way out of the impasse. The world watched and waited, hoping against hope that a solution could be found before the conflict escalated further.
Section 8. Secret Talks, a Glimmer of Hope in Switzerland. In the quiet Swiss city of Geneva, far from the battlefields of Korea, a glimmer of hope emerged. Secret negotiations, initiated by the Swiss government, brought representatives from both sides to the table. The talks were tense, fraught with mistrust, and the baggage of decades of animosity. But both sides, weary of the endless bloodshed and the threat of nuclear annihilation, recognized the need for a negotiated settlement. Compromises were made, concessions offered and accepted. Slowly, painstakingly, a path towards peace began to emerge.
The world, starved for good news, reacted with cautious optimism. Could this be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? Or was it just another false dawn, destined to be extinguished by the flames of war? Only time would tell. Section 9. Scars of War. A Fragile Peace and an Uncertain Future. After months of agonizing negotiations, a ceasefire agreement was finally reached. The guns fell silent. The fighting was over. But the road ahead was long and uncertain. The Korean Peninsula, once a land of breathtaking beauty, was scarred by war, its people traumatized by the violence they had endured. The ceasefire was just the first step on a long and arduous journey towards lasting peace. The underlying issues that had led to the conflict remained unresolved. Mistrust ran deep on both sides. The threat of renewed conflict, while diminished, was ever present. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare of a nuclear war had been averted. But the lessons of the conflict were clear. The dangers of unchecked aggression, the human cost of conflict, and the urgent need for diplomacy and dialogue. The world had come perilously close to the brink. It was a lesson they would not soon forget.